The May light over the North Atlantic was thin and glass-like when USS Squalus slipped beneath the surface for what should have been a routine test dive. The crew felt only the familiar shudder of the ballast tanks taking in water. 30 seconds later, without warning, the submarine stopped answering the world above. What began as a simple descent became a silence no one expected, a silence so complete that even veteran sailors felt something colder than the sea settle in their stomachs. 240 feet below, 59 men were pressed into a darkness that seemed to swallow every sound. The steel hull creaked under the pressure as the temperature dropped degree by degree. For the trapped crew, time no longer moved forward. It tightened, shrinking into the rhythmic hiss of failing airlines and the slow awareness that they were now guests of the deep. No man shouted. There was nothing to say. Up the coast, Rear Admiral Cole received the fragmented distress signal, a burst of static, a half-formed word, then a line that died mid-sentence. He stared at the receiver long after the room fell quiet, knowing that the worst disasters rarely announce themselves clearly. When a submarine goes missing, every minute is a negotiation with death. Rescue ships pushed out from Portsmouth at full throttle, their hulls cutting through calm water that offered no clue of what lay below. Sailors scanned the surface for debris, for air bubbles, for any sign that the men could still be reached. But the ocean kept its secrets. It always had. The first bubble broke the stillness hours later. Oil, splintered debris, and the end of a telephone cable that should have remained intact. To the watching crews, it was a message written in the language of disaster. The sea had exhaled, but not in relief, yet the Atlantic was deceptively peaceful, its horizon unbroken, its surface almost serene. Beneath that quiet veneer, a catastrophe was unfolding with the weight of a collapsing world, and on one of the ships above, a single officer stepped forward, carrying a device the Navy once dismissed as little more than an engineer's fantasy. What they did not yet realize was that this unlikely invention would soon challenge the ocean itself. Water entered the aft compartments with a violence no one inside Squalus had time to comprehend. A single valve failure became a torrent, sweeping through machinery spaces and drowning 26 men before they could reach a ladder or close a hatch. The survivors heard only the echo of metal doors sealing behind the flood, each clang marking a life that would not return. In the sudden stillness that followed, the submarine felt less like a vessel and more like a tomb sinking slowly through cold water. The remaining crew gathered in the forward torpedo room, the only compartment still holding against the sea. Here the temperature dropped with each passing hour, their breath turning to mist in the stale air. Carbon dioxide crept upward in the sealed space, burning throats and fogging thoughts. No one spoke loudly. Fear had a sound of its own, soft, steady, and disciplined by necessity. They tried to speak to the world above through the emergency buoy line, tapping messages into the cable that connected them to the surface. It was a fragile lifeline, little more than hope wrapped in steel. Some tapped steadily, using the rhythm to steady themselves. Others prayed silently, trusting that somewhere far above, someone might hear the faint percussion rising through 240 feet of Atlantic water. Whispers became strategy. Men rationed air by speaking only in fragments, conserving the oxygen that remained. Even breathing became intentional, slow, measured, a form of collective discipline that bound the survivors together more tightly than any order ever issued. A young machinist kept watch on the dim bulbs strung along the bulkhead, counting the seconds between their flickers. Battery power was fading, and he knew the truth. No one dared voice. Once the light died, the air systems would follow. Time itself was draining away. Far above, Search crews leaned over the rail of a rescue ship, headsets pressed tight, listening for anything that might break the ocean's silence. Then, faint and improbable, came a pattern of taps, steady, deliberate, undeniably human. The boat still lived, but the margin for saving her had shrunk to hours, and the sea was not inclined to wait. Lieutenant Samdiar Charles Swede Mommsen stepped onto the deck of USS Falcon with the unhurried confidence of a man who had fought this battle long before the ocean forced his hand. Behind him, secured under canvas and steel, rested the device that had defined his career and nearly ended it, a diving bell, unlike anything the Navy had ever trusted in open water. To many officers watching from the rail, it looked less like a tool of salvation and more like an untested gamble carried into a rising sea. Around the vessel, engineers exchanged quiet doubts as they studied the gray Atlantic. The waves were beginning to muscle against the hull, rolling in from the east with the promise of worsening weather. "Depth complicates everything," they murmured. 240 feet is not a test depth, it is a verdict. And yet the bell stood ready, its curved frame waiting for a task it had never performed outside controlled trials. For years the contraption had been dismissed as little more than an inventor's eccentricity, labeled impractical, unpredictable, even dangerously experimental. Critics argued that no mechanical chamber could be lowered with precision in open seas, let alone seal to a crippled submarine. But Mommsen had never wavered. He understood that new ideas rarely earn their worth until the old ways have already failed. He ordered his team to prepare the bell with the same calm tone he used in drills. Ropes were checked, guidelines stretched, and air systems inspected bolt by bolt. The divers who would accompany the chamber walked the deck with deliberate steps, memorizing every cleat and fastening. They knew the margin for error was thin. A misaligned latch or tangled cable could claim their lives before they even touched the submarine below. As the afternoon deepened, the wind gathered strength, pushing the sea into long, heaving swells that battered the ship with rhythmic insistence. Each roll reminded the rescuers that the trapped men had less and less time in the dark hull beneath them. The ocean would soon decide the outcome if they did not act first. The bell was lifted from its cradle, swaying gently as it rose over the water. Its first true test, long postponed and often doubted, was finally at hand, just as another challenge quietly formed beyond the horizon. In the quiet years of the 1920s, before the era of fleet submarines and deep ocean ambitions, Charles Swede Mommsen was already pressing against the walls of naval tradition. He was a young officer then, newly assigned to the submarine division, studying not torpedoes or propulsion, but something far less respected, the survival of sailors when the sea turned against them. At a time when the Navy viewed submarine mishaps as tragic but inevitable, Mommsen treated each loss as an unanswered question. Why must a trapped crew be written off before a single rescue attempt had been made? Why should men die simply because no one had dared to rethink the problem? His first attempt at an answer was small, almost inelegant. A compact breathing apparatus that allowed a submariner to ascend from a disabled boat without drowning or rupturing his lungs. The Mommsen lung, as it came to be known, was met at first with raised eyebrows and polite dismissal. Admirals called it unnecessary. Traditionalists called it risky. But Mommsen insisted on tests, and when those tests proved that men could reach the surface alive, resistance softened. The device became standard issue, saving lives before the decade was out. It was a modest victory, but to Mommsen it confirmed a deeper truth. The sea did not have to write the final line of every disaster. Even then, he found his thoughts drifting towards something larger, something that seemed almost impossible. If breathing devices could ferry a single man upward, could a mechanical chamber lift an entire compartment to safety? He sketched the idea quietly, shaping the vision of a steel capsule that could lock onto a sunken submarine and carry survivors to the surface. It was a bold proposition, well beyond the Navy's patience for experimental engineering. When he presented the concept to senior leadership, the reaction was swift and predictably cold. Submarines, the admirals reminded him, were instruments of stealth and endurance, not platforms for elaborate rescue apparatus. They were built to disappear, and sometimes they did so permanently. Calling them coffins by design echoed not cynicism, but long-standing belief. To challenge that belief was to challenge tradition itself, but Mommsen carried a memory he could not ignore: the 1927 sinking of the USS S4, a disaster that had unfolded painfully, hour by hour, while divers above struggled to reach her trapped crew. He remembered the tapping signals, the pleas for air, and the moment those signals stopped. The helplessness of that day never left him. It hardened into resolve, a promise that no future sailor should die simply because no tool existed to reach him. So he formed a small, almost invisible team, working in a corner of the Navy Yard where few officers bothered to look. They welded crude prototypes, cylinders of rough steel and awkward joints, testing them in shallow water with little more than resourcefulness to guide them. Slowly, the design improved. Stronger seals, better buoyancy control, a method to clamp securely to a submarine's hatch. Progress came quietly, without ceremony. Years later, after countless trials and a cautious evaluation board, the Navy authorized the construction of a single rescue bell. The approval was measured, almost reluctant, a concession more symbolic than anything else. Few expected it to be used. Even fewer believed it could succeed. But the ocean does not measure belief, and somewhere ahead, a crippled boat waited for the proof they never imagined would arrive. In the days before Squalus slipped beneath the Atlantic, the mood among her crew reflected a service in transition. Submariners who once accepted danger as a constant companion now spoke with a new sense of assurance, an assurance born not of bravado, but of faith in the advances that had reshaped their boats. Steel was thicker, valves were stronger, and engineering standards, after 2 decades of lessons written in loss, seemed finally to have caught up with the sea. To many aboard, the era of fatal mishaps felt as though it had passed quietly into history. Squalus herself was regarded as proof of this progress. She was modern by every measure: improved ballast systems, updated electrical circuits, and watertight compartments designed with a precision earlier classes could only envy. Officers described her as near unsinkable by peacetime expectations. Inspections had been diligent, trials meticulous, and every report returned with the same comforting verdict. She was ready. She was safe. She was the product of engineers who believed they had solved the problems that once doomed their predecessors. During drills, the crew often joked about this newfound security. Yet flooding scenarios were practiced almost with amusement, as if the idea of catastrophic failure belonged to another generation. Men laughed while donning escape gear, confident that the drills were exercises in theory rather than precautions rooted in possibility. They trusted the machinery, and they trusted the men who maintained it. In routine briefings, officers spoke not of danger, but of efficiency and discipline, hallmarks of a fleet moving confidently into the future. Across the submarine service, this sentiment had taken firm hold. The tragedies of the S-boats, their sudden floodings, their trapped crews, their helpless signals, felt distant, softened by time and by the belief that those disasters had been addressed, not merely remembered. The newer fleet boats were sturdier, better designed, better understood. Many believed that the ocean's most lethal tricks had already been studied, catalogued, and outmaneuvered. Yet within that confidence lay a quiet vulnerability. Every system aboard a submarine, no matter how sophisticated, depends on valves, seals, and the men entrusted to watch them. Machinery fails, sensors misread. The smallest fault can unravel the strongest chain. But in the calm days before the dive, such thoughts drifted no further than the margins of technical manuals. No one imagined that an overlooked weakness, deep within a single line of equipment, could undo everything they believed. For all their preparation, the sea had its own ledger, its own unspoken tests, and it was patient. Soon, the Atlantic would remind them that confidence, no matter how carefully engineered, is never a substitute for certainty. On the surface, as USS Falcon and her sister ships held position over the silent shape of Squalus, the rescue crews gathered to debate the oldest question in maritime salvation: trust the methods they knew, or gamble on the machine they did not. Around chart tables and wind-lashed decks, officers reviewed the traditional playbook: send divers down the telephone line, attach lifting cables, attempt to pump air into the flooded compartments. These were the techniques that had been used for decades, familiar and orderly, grounded in long practice. Yet each method relied on time, and time, they all understood, was the one resource already slipping away. Some argued that Mommsen's bell, untested in real conditions, would cost them precious hours they could not afford to lose. They pointed to the rising swell, the wind building from the southwest, the barometer falling in a slow but steady descent. Lowering a fragile prototype into a sea that refused to stay still seemed reckless. A cable winch could fail, a guide line could snap, and if the bell were damaged, they would be forced back to the very techniques they had set aside, now with even less time to use them. Reports from the horizon only deepened the tension. Weather stations warned of increasing gusts and sharper waves, conditions that could turn a delicate rescue operation into a battle against the elements themselves. Clouds massed in broken formations, hinting at the edge of a developing front. Each gust struck the rescue ships with a force that reminded them just how narrow the margin for survival truly was. Many officers clung to established procedure, framing their arguments with words like controlled, predictable, and safe. Traditional methods might be slow, but they were understood. The bell, by contrast, seemed an intrusion of possibility, an invention that made no promise except uncertainty. In the cautious world of naval rescue, uncertainty carried a weight all its own. Yet beneath them, 33 men waited in a confined chamber, breathing air that grew more poisonous with every minute. Hypothermia pressed into their bones. Carbon dioxide thickened the atmosphere, blurring thoughts and slowing reflexes. Panic, though suppressed by discipline, hovered at the edges of endurance. Each hour above translated into peril below, and the ocean did not pause for debate. A single decision now stood between life and death. The officers knew it. The divers preparing their gear felt it. Even the quiet deckhands sensed the tension in the air, as though the ship itself listened for a choice not yet spoken. Mommsen understood the stakes with a clarity that silenced his doubts. Breaking with the careful cadence of naval protocol, he issued the order with a calmness that cut through the arguments around him. Prepare the bell, full speed. Lines were run out, cables tightened, compressors tested. His voice carried no bravado, only the steady conviction of a man who knew that hesitation could kill more surely than the sea. As the crews rushed to comply, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the first hint of the storm to come. And in that gathering weather, another decision waited quietly for them just beyond the next wave. The diving bell left the deck, with a slow, ponderous swing, its steel frame glinting once before the sea swallowed it whole. As the winch paid out cable, the chamber groaned under its own weight, each rivet and seam answering the ocean's pull with a muted complaint. The men inside felt the pressure deepen with every foot of descent, a tightening grip that reminded them how little stood between life and the water pressing from every direction. Above them, the ship rolled in the rising swell, sending vibrations down the cable that traveled like distant thunder. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. The Atlantic, churned by wind and clouded by silt, offered no light to guide them. The Belle's small windows revealed only darkness, thick, unbroken, absolute. Diving lines had been lowered earlier, and now the support divers followed them by touch alone, their gloved hands sliding along rope gone slick with algae and salt. The ocean, indifferent to urgency, moved them like driftwood, forcing each diver to check position by the pressure on the line rather than by sight. This was descent by instinct, by discipline, by faith that the equipment designed in calm water would hold in the restless deep. Far below, in the forward torpedo room of Squalus, the survivors were fading. Their air was thin, their limbs stiffening, their thoughts drifting between hope and resignation. But then, carried faintly through the steel hull, came a distant clang, a metallic tremor that traveled through bolts and bulkheads like a whispered signal. The men froze. Someone struck again. The sound was faint, uncertain, but unmistakably human. For the first time since the submarine settled on the seabed, they understood. Someone was coming. Up above, the Belle continued its slow approach. At 200 feet, the cable hummed under the combined forces of current and strain. The divers, now working blind, reached the submarine's bow by following the faint outline of the hull with their hands. It loomed out of the black like a dead leviathan, barnacled with silt and resting at an angle difficult to judge. The Belle had to be guided to the escape hatch, no small task in a sea that pushed and twisted with each passing gust at the surface. When the chamber finally reached the submarine's position, the final challenge lay ahead, aligning it with the forward escape trunk. The Belle swung in the current, bumping against the hull with a hollow resonance that echoed through the trapped compartment. The divers pushed against the chamber with methodical force, muscles straining against the surge. The Belle drifted, corrected, drifted again. Precision was everything. The slightest misalignment could jam the mechanism, or worse, crack a seal that would allow seawater to invade both the submarine and the Belle at once. Inside the chamber, the operators adjusted ballast, shifted weight, and issued calm corrections through intercom lines that crackled with static. Then, at last, the guide ring met the hatch, combing with a heavy metallic thud. The chamber settled. A breath was held. For a moment, no one moved, waiting to learn whether the ocean would permit the connection. Seal integrity remained the great unknown. The divers confirmed the alignment by touch, then sent the signal. Inside the Belle, the operator initiated air equalization. What followed sounded like a storm unbound. Air roared through the chamber, forcing pressure into the submarine's trunk, testing every gasket, every bolt, every joint. The structure vibrated with the ferocity of the exchange. If a single seam failed, seawater would flood both vessels before anyone could react. But the seals held. Slowly, the pressure equalized. The thunder subsided. The Belle operator reached for the hatch wheel. Metal scraped. Air hissed. Then, with a reluctant groan, the submarine's escape trunk opened. A rush of cold, dense air spilled into the chamber. Beyond the narrow threshold, faces emerged, pale with cold, eyes reddened from carbon dioxide, expressions caught between disbelief and exhaustion. 33 men who had prepared themselves for the worst now stared upward at the improbable arrival of life. Their ordeal was not over. The sea had allowed them this moment, but the ascent still waited, and the Atlantic, restless and rising, was far from finished with them. The moment the hatch opened, Mommsen saw what the Atlantic had done to the men inside Squalus. Their faces were drained of color, their movements slowed by cold and carbon dioxide, their eyes adjusting painfully to the dim light of the bell. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a quiet recognition flickered, an understanding that the impossible had arrived. One by one, Mommsen and his team helped the first group of survivors into the cramped steel chamber, guiding them with hands steady from training, but trembling from the weight of the moment. The bell had been built for 6 men at a time. Tonight it felt barely large enough to hold hope itself. Inside the tight confines, the rescued sailors whispered their thanks, voices thin and ragged. Some clutched at the chamber's handrails, not for balance, but to reassure themselves that the cold metal was real. Others simply folded onto the floor, too weak to stand, staring at the narrow walls that were at once a prison and a promise. For hours they had rationed each breath, counting down the dwindling supply of air. Now, even in the gloom, they could sense life returning in small increments. Mommsen secured the hatch and gave the signal. The ascent began with a groan of cable and the slow upward pull that felt more like faith than machinery. In the heavy swell, the bell swayed as though caught between 2 worlds, one that had nearly claimed the men inside, and one still roiled by wind and uncertainty. Every shift of the sea sent vibrations through the chamber, a reminder that the ocean was not finished testing them. For the survivors, each yard upward felt like a negotiation with fate. On the surface, the rescue ship's crew listened for the bell's return, straining to hear anything above the crash of waves and the metallic chatter of rigging. When at last the chamber broke the surface and rose dripping from the Atlantic, a cheer rolled across the deck, brief, restrained, but unmistakably human. Sailors rushed to the platform as the hatch opened, and the first rescued men emerged into daylight they had not expected to see again. Some blinked against the brightness, others simply breathed deeply, their lungs filling with cold air that tasted like resurrection. Far below, in the torpedo room, the remaining survivors heard the muffled sound of the hatch closing above them. The echo traveled through the hull like a heartbeat, faint, rhythmic, reassuring. They listened as the bell was hauled upward, and then as the vibrations faded into distance. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat, but of waiting. They knew the bell had to return, and they knew it might have to battle a worsening sea to reach them. Men counted the passing minutes against their own fatigue, trusting that the same miracle would descend again. On the surface, however, the challenges were multiplying. Engineers stood over the cable drums, gauging the tension in the rigging. Each ascent and descent added strain to the already taxed system. Metal creaked under loads never simulated in calm water trials. Bolts warmed from friction. Even the winches began to show signs of fatigue, their gears grinding with the protest of machinery pushed to its limits. The officers exchanged quiet glances, calculations of risk, estimates of how many more trips the hardware could endure. But the bell was needed. There were still men waiting below. Mommsen ordered preparations for the second descent. The wind had climbed, sharpening the waves into steep, chopping swells that slapped hard against the hull. Darkness gathered along the horizon, smearing the line between sky and sea. As the chamber was swung out once more, spray rose over the deck, cold and heavy enough to sting the skin. The rescuers braced themselves, aware that each return to the depths demanded more of the equipment, more of the divers, and more of the ocean's mercy. The bell dropped again through the surface, swallowed instantly by the rising night. Its lanterns flickered as the cable paid out, vanishing into the black water that hid both danger and the men who still depended on it. And with every foot of descent, the sea tightened its grip, preparing to test whether the next journey would be as forgiving as the first. The second lift began with a warning the crew had hoped never to hear, the screech of a jammed cable somewhere deep within the winch assembly. The bell had barely cleared the submarine's hatch when the line jolted, shuddering under uneven tension. Deckhands ran to the drums, hands on the steel housing, feeling for heat, for vibration, for any hint of imminent failure. A leaking air fitting on the chamber added another layer of danger, hissing in uneven bursts as pressure fluctuated. It was the sort of mechanical chorus that seasoned sailors recognized instantly. The equipment was nearing its limits. Below the surface, divers fought to maintain their grip along the guidelines. Their gloves, stiff from hours submerged, no longer sealed perfectly against the icy water. The Atlantic at 38 degrees, stole warmth without mercy, numbing their fingers until tools slipped and knots resisted untying. Every simple action became a test of endurance. The lead diver paused to shake feeling back into his hands, knowing that fatigue was more dangerous than the depth itself. They had trained for cold water, but training had not prepared them for exhaustion that crept into the bones. On the surface, the sea state had turned decisively hostile. Waves rose in steep-sided walls that crashed over the support ship's bow, sending sheets of water washing across the deck. Even the experienced officers braced against the sudden rolls, boots skidding on slick iron. The bell, suspended between ship and sea, swung unpredictably as wind gusts caught the cable. Each violent sway translated downward, making the chamber's ascent a slow oscillation. Forward, backward, upward, like a pendulum testing the strength of every joint. Below, in Squalus, the remaining survivors sensed the change. The air had grown thicker, heavier. Carbon dioxide levels had crossed from discomfort into danger. Men coughed into their sleeves, their breaths rasping in a space now sour with exhaled gases. Thoughts blurred, a few saw movement where none existed. A flicker in the corner of the eye, a shape against the bulkhead. Hallucinations were not uncommon under such conditions. The brain, starved of oxygen, reached for patterns to explain the failing chemistry of the blood. One man asked for water that didn't exist. Another insisted he heard voices outside the hull. The chief petty officer kept them anchored by calling names, checking pulse and response, reminding them that the bell would return. Up above, Mommsen understood these signals even before they were sent. Years of studying rescue conditions had taught him how quickly carbon dioxide poisoned discipline. He recalculated pressure changes, air consumption, and ascent rates on the fly, adjusting procedures to safeguard the next transfer. The bell operator received a rapid sequence of new instructions, altering ballast adjustments, modifying equalization technique, and shortening the margin between cycles. Mommsen's voice remained calm, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. They were losing their window. The third group reached the surface just as the wind shifted sharply, turning waves into a confused cross-sea that slammed the ship from multiple angles. The rescued sailors spilled from the chamber pale and trembling, collapsing into blankets held by waiting corpsmen. One man pressed his face into the deck, whispering that the wood felt like solid earth after the days of drifting in darkness. The cheering that greeted them was quieter this time. The crew understood what the worsening conditions meant. The bell could be forced to stop. Dark clouds thickened over the horizon, washing the daylight into muted grays. Officers consulted the barometer and studied the swells, knowing the next descent might be the last attempt permitted by physics and equipment. Yet below the surface, men were still waiting. Abandoning them was not an option anyone was willing to name aloud. The winch operator wiped salt from his eyes, staring at the frayed section of cable that had groaned during the lift. It would hold a bit longer, he insisted to himself. It had to hold. Engineers worked feverishly to re-grease fittings, adjust tension, and replace seals, their movements quick but meticulous. Every repair had to be perfect. There would be no time for further corrections once the bell left the deck again. As the sun dipped behind the rising weather front, Mommsen made his decision. One more descent, no matter the sea, no matter the strain. The final group below had waited long enough. The bell was readied once more, its steel sides rattling in the wind, its cables singing under mounting pressure. When it swung out over the water, the deck fell silent except for the pulse of the storm gathering beyond the ship. And as the chamber dropped toward the waiting darkness, even the most seasoned rescuers understood what the ocean was preparing to test next. Night came to the Atlantic not as a slow dimming, but as a sudden extinguishing of the world. The horizon vanished into a single, unbroken sheet of black. Wind carved white scars across the surface, and waves, now cresting at 10 feet, rose and collapsed like moving walls. Spotlights from the rescue ships swept across the heaving water, their beams trembling as the vessels rolled under the storm's first true gusts. Each flash of light illuminated the spray for only a heartbeat before darkness reclaimed everything. On the bridge of USS Falcon, officers gathered in tight formation around the chart table. Boots braced against the pitching deck. The question none wanted to voice had become unavoidable. Suspend the operation until daylight, or continue a descent that now bordered on the unmanageable. Some argued for caution. The bell had already completed more cycles than anyone imagined possible, and the rigging was near its breaking point. A failure in the night, one insisted, would not only doom the survivors below, but might also take divers and deck crew with it. The sea was no longer merely adverse, it was hostile. Mommsen listened, arms folded, the storm reflected in the glass of the bridge windows. He weighed each argument, each risk, each calculation of tension and load. But the image of the men still waiting inside Squalus was never far from his mind. They had endured darkness, cold, and poisoned air for more than 30 hours. Another night would mean hypothermia, creeping into the last reserves of their strength. Carbon dioxide would rise past the threshold of consciousness. The margin for their survival had already shrunk to minutes, not hours. He answered without raising his voice. Suspension was impossible. The mission would proceed. The order rippled across the deck, steadying the men even as the wind sought to unbalance them. The bell was prepared once more, its hull glistening under the trembling beams of the spotlights. As the winch lifted it from the deck, a sudden roll sent the chamber swinging hard to port. For one breathless moment it drifted toward the side of the ship, steel threatening steel, before hands and lines corrected its motion. The crew exhaled as the bell steadied, suspended like a solitary lantern above an ocean intent on swallowing it. Then came the drop. The chamber plunged into the water with a heavy splash, the cable humming under strain. The first 10 feet were chaos. Waves heaved the bell upward and downward, pulling cable through the drum in jerks that made engineers flinch. Every creak of metal sounded amplified in the night air. If even one strand in the cable parted, the bell would fall freely into darkness, taking its operators with it. The sea, indifferent to their mission, pushed against the chamber from below, tilting it at angles that forced the divers to fight for control. As the bell descended past the turbulent surface layer, motion stabilized, but tension did not. Rigging groaned like a wounded animal, metal flexing under loads it was never designed to endure. The winch operator monitored the gauges with unwavering eyes, watching the needle flirt with the danger mark. A spike, a jolt, either could mean catastrophe. Engineers paced behind him, calculating failure points in their heads, knowing that a single snap would echo through the hull like a fatal gunshot. Yet the line held. Slowly, steadily, the bell sank toward the waiting submarine. Inside Squalus, the remaining survivors heard the vibrations first, faint, halting, like the heartbeat of a machine fighting its way back to them. Hope flared in men who had nearly forgotten what it felt like. They gathered near the escape trunk, shoulders touching, breath shallow. When the bell struck the hull with a dull clang, the sound traveled through the steel like a message. It had returned. But the challenge was not over. At depth, currents pressed unevenly against the chamber, tilting it as the operators attempted to align the guide ring with the hatch. It took minutes that felt like hours. The bell pushed, drifted, corrected, drifted again. One diver, nearly numb with cold, braced himself against the hull to steady the connection. The pressure threatened to twist the chamber away at the final moment. Then, contact. The ring met the hatch, combing with a heavy, unmistakable thud. A pause followed. No one spoke. No one breathed. They waited to learn whether the sea would accept the seal or punish their persistence. Against all expectation, the indicator needle steadied. The lock had taken. The equalization system roared to life, filling the chamber and trunk with a sound like distant thunder. And somewhere deep in the hull of Squalus, men who had nearly been lost felt the first breath of new air press against their faces, not yet knowing that the storm above was preparing one more trial of its own. The final survivors of Squalus were no longer walking so much as drifting, men suspended between consciousness and collapse. When the hatch opened for the last time, they did not rise to greet the rescuers. They crawled, hands scraped against cold steel, legs trembling under the strain of hours spent in poisoned air. One sailor whispered an apology as he was lifted into the bell, as though his weakness were an inconvenience. Another simply stared ahead, eyes glassy, unable to process that salvation had come. Mommsen and his team guided them in gently, almost reverently. These were the last voices of the dead boat, rescued on the edge of silence. Inside the bell, the space felt smaller than ever. Breath formed clouds that hung in the dim light, each exhalation carrying the unmistakable tang of carbon dioxide and fear. The chamber shuddered as the crew secured the hatch, sealing the men inside their final passage from the deep. Outside, the sea hammered the bell with a relentless rhythm, reminding them that the most difficult journey was still ahead. Mommsen gave the signal. The ascent began, not as a controlled lift, but as a race against a storm that had been gathering strength with every passing hour. The cable strained as the bell rose through the uneven water column. Waves drove the chamber sideways, sending vibrations through the rigging and into the support ship above. On deck, engineers leaned over the drums, watching the tension gauges edge toward limits rarely tested in peacetime conditions. Every jolt traveled up the metal lines like a warning. The wind, now steady at gale force, cut across the deck and made speech nearly impossible. Orders came as gestures, sharp and urgent. Halfway to the surface, a sound split through the storm. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. One cable strand had snapped. Everyone froze. Men who had been shouting moments before fell silent, listening with held breath for the catastrophic report that would follow if more strands gave way. The winch operator braced himself, hands hovering over the brake lever, ready to counter a freefall that would drop the bell like a stone into the abyss. The second strand groaned, but held. Mommsen moved to the readouts, scanning the numbers even as the deck rolled beneath him. Years of engineering study, hundreds of hours spent calculating load curves and pressure tolerances, now condensed into instinct. He adjusted tension incrementally, easing strain where he could, compensating where the system threatened to give. His voice cut through the wind with the calm of a man who had already made peace with the risk. "Slow it 2 feet. Hold. Bring her up steady." The operators responded, trusting his judgment over the instruments that flickered with salt water. The bell continued upward, slower now, almost painfully gradual, but upward nonetheless. Each foot gained felt like defiance. The men inside swayed with the chamber, their breaths shallow, their bodies too spent to brace. In the darkness, one sailor murmured a prayer. Another leaned his head against the wall, eyes closed, letting the motion rock him like a cradle. They were no longer fighting the sea. They were enduring it. At last, a pale glow touched the windows of the bell. Then, with a violent heave of the swell, the chamber broke the surface. Spotlights caught it in mid-swing, a dripping mass of steel rising and falling like a pendulum above the chaotic water. Crewmen rushed to secure it, seizing guidelines, shouting warnings as waves threatened to capsize the rig. The chamber lurched dangerously as it was pulled toward the platform. One hard strike against the hull would end the rescue even this close to success. But hands held fast. The bell was steadied. The hatch wheel turned. One by one they emerged. 33 men who had been sealed inside a dying submarine only hours earlier now stood beneath the storm-dark sky, blinking against rain and floodlights. Some collapsed onto the deck. Others remained upright through sheer will, shoulders trembling as rescuers wrapped them in blankets. A few wept silently, not from fear, but from the release of holding on too long. There had been no fatalities among the survivors. 33 men accounted for, all alive. The Atlantic answered with a roar, waves crashing against the ship as though the ocean itself resisted giving them back. Spray lashed across the deck, cold and heavy, but for the first time since squalor slipped beneath the surface, the rescuers felt the weight of the sea begin to lift, and as the storm pressed around them, another question rose quietly among the crew, one that would soon change the course of submarine history forever. The deck lights cut through the storm-torn night, turning rain into falling shards of silver as the rescued sailors stepped onto solid steel. For a moment they simply stood there, blinking into the brightness, unable to reconcile the sudden glare with the darkness they had left behind. Corpsmen moved among them with blankets, wrapping each man in layers of wool that clung to their soaked uniforms. Some sailors shivered uncontrollably. Others stared at their hands, as though surprised to see them still attached. Nothing about the deck felt real. Nothing about the world above seemed entirely possible. Medical officers inspected them with a mixture of clinical focus and quiet astonishment. By every standard written before this night, survival at 240 feet had been presumed improbable, nearly impossible, especially after the hours those men had endured in cold, stale air. Yet here they were, disoriented, weak, but alive. Their lungs had resisted collapse. Their minds had stayed anchored through hallucinations and fear. Hypothermia had crept close, but had not claimed them. It was a triumph as much physiological as mechanical, a testament to discipline maintained in the face of the deep's most subtle tortures. By dawn, word of the rescue had already slipped past military channels. When the battered ships arrived at the Portsmouth pier, a quiet crowd had gathered, dock workers, civilians, and reporters drawn by whispers of a miracle. They watched as the survivors were carried or guided down gangways, their expressions blank with exhaustion, yet unmistakably human in their relief. Cameras clicked, notebooks filled. Some journalists asked questions, but most simply observed, aware that history was passing in front of them in an unsteady line of men wrapped in navy grey. The Navy, for its part, responded with the restraint of an institution forced to reconsider its own doctrine. Official statements were sparse, measured, and almost reluctant, crafted to acknowledge the rescue while avoiding the admission that old assumptions had failed. Yet inside the offices where policy was shaped, the meaning was unmistakable. Submarine rescue, once regarded as fantasy, had decisively entered the realm of the possible. The Belle had proven itself under conditions that no trial could have simulated. Procedures long considered imitable were suddenly being rewritten in pencil, then ink. The critics who had dismissed Mommsen's inventions now found themselves re-evaluating every argument they had once made with certainty. Admirals who had called the Belle impractical reviewed diagrams with renewed interest. Engineers who had questioned the concept now studied the equipment with a craftsman's respect. Even the skeptics aboard Falcon, men who had feared the machine would fail in the first hour, stood quietly as they watched the survivors being escorted to waiting ambulances. Doubt had yielded to evidence, and evidence carried a weight no opinion could displace. Mommsen moved through the scene with the same calm that had guided him through the long night. Journalists pressed toward him, eager for a statement, for a heroic quote, for anything that might capture the magnitude of what had just unfolded. He gave them little. "The men saved themselves," he said. "We only gave them the chance." It was not false modesty. It was the truth as he saw it. The trapped sailors had kept order in suffocating confinement. They had resisted panic. They had survived long enough for rescue to reach them. Technology had been the bridge. Willpower had been the foundation. Later, as the last stretcher was lifted from the deck, and the storm clouds began to thin into streaks of morning blue, the Belle sat quietly beside its cradle, dented, salt-streaked, the paint scoured by hours of strain. It did not look like a revolutionary machine. It looked like work, welded seams, heavy bolts, thick glass, yet inside its steel walls, a new chapter in undersea rescue had been written, line by line, under the worst conditions the Atlantic could conjure. What began as an experiment had become a precedent. New designs would follow, stronger bells, deeper-rated chambers, better training, better doctrine. The Navy would never again assume that a sunken submarine meant certain death. The horizon of possibility had shifted, and far from the noise of reporters and officials, the sea rolled on with quiet indifference, unaware that one of history's boundaries had just moved beneath its surface, setting the stage for the final revelation yet to come. In the weeks that followed the rescue, the Atlantic's roar faded into paperwork, diagrams, and testimony. The court of inquiry convened in a quiet naval chamber, far from the storm that had shaped the story. Here, investigators assembled the broken pieces of Squallus's final dive, searching not for blame, but for understanding. Engineers laid out fractured components across long wooden tables. Officers compared logs, timings, and survivor statements, tracing the path of disaster back through the submarine systems with the patience of surgeons reconstructing a wound. What emerged was not a complicated sequence of failures, but a single, devastating truth. One valve, simple, unremarkable, rarely noticed, had stuck open during the dive. It was a minor malfunction in isolation, a routine part prone to wear, but 50 feet below the surface, that stuck valve allowed seawater to surge into the aft compartments with a force no man could have halted. The flooding had been instantaneous, overwhelming, catastrophic. There had been no warning, no decision that might have changed the outcome. For the investigators, the starkness of the finding carried its own weight. Technology had advanced, procedures had improved, confidence had grown, but the ocean required only a moment to remind them of its power. As the hearings continued, the engineers who had once championed the modern submarine found themselves confronted by the hubris that had quietly settled into their assumptions. They had believed the newest boats were safe beyond question, that careful design could banish the tragedies of earlier decades. The court forced them to face what the sea had revealed. Progress was not immunity. Even the most sophisticated machines remained vulnerable to the smallest overlooked flaw. In the chamber's somber atmosphere, this realization felt less like a reprimand and more like a reckoning. Survivors took the stand, their voices measured, sometimes distant. They described the hours sealed inside the forward torpedo room, how the lights flickered, how the air turned sour, how the men spoke in whispers to conserve oxygen. One sailor recalled counting the seconds between electrical flickers, convinced he was timing the approach of death. Another spoke of the moment they realized the tapping they heard through the hull was not the groaning of steel, but the rescue bell arriving from above. Their testimonies were simple, unembellished. The court listened in silence, aware that no document could capture the particular quiet that exists between hope and surrender. When Mommsen addressed the panel, he spoke with the same calm that had steadied his crew during the storm. He explained every technical decision in deliberate detail: air pressures, cable loading curves, ballast adjustments, equalization sequences. There was no dramatization in his voice, no flourish, no attempt to claim victory. He focused on procedure, on discipline, on the work of his team. The court recognized the understated authority of a man who had long understood that the ocean rewarded preparation, not pride. From these proceedings came the foundation of new doctrine. Emergency protocols were rewritten to account for the vulnerabilities revealed by Squalus. Rescue bell procedures were codified, equipment upgraded, divers retrained, submarines received new valves, new fail-safes, new maintenance orders designed to ensure that a stuck fitting could never again bring down a vessel without warning. What had begun as tragedy became instruction, and instruction, repeated, improved, made habitual, became legacy. The court's work ended with no grand declaration, no single sentence that captured everything the rescue had meant. But as the panel adjourned, the Navy understood that its underwater future had shifted. The lessons of Squalus would endure, carried forward not only in technical manuals, but in the quiet memory of the men who survived the darkness. And somewhere beyond the courtroom's walls, preparations were already beginning for the next chapter the deep would demand. In the months after the Squalus rescue, the strange steel chamber that had once been dismissed as an engineer's indulgence began its quiet transformation into a cornerstone of naval doctrine. What Mommsen had built in obscurity and tested under the most unforgiving conditions the Atlantic could muster was no longer a curiosity. It was a blueprint. The Navy commissioned additional bells, refining their contours, strengthening their seals, and standardizing their operations until they formed the backbone of a fleet-wide rescue program. Where once there had been doubt, now there was direction. Undersea disaster no longer meant inevitability. Across the submarine force, vessels newly fitted with escape trunks and reinforced coamings bore the unmistakable mark of hard-earned lessons. Workshops constructed standardized mating rings based on the dimensions taken directly from Squalus's battered hull. Welders in shipyards from Portsmouth to Mare Island repeated the same patterns, rings of steel that would allow any bell on any ocean to join with any submarine in distress. What had been improvised during the rescue now became uniform, codified not in theory, but in the metal of each new boat. When war broke out in the early 1940s, the bell faced its next test, not in drills, but in combat conditions where torpedoes, mines, and depth charges turned lessons into necessities. Wartime exercises revealed the device's resilience. Bells descended through night-black water, through thermoclines and turbulence, locking onto submarines to extract crews during simulated emergencies. Officers noted that even under hurried wartime conditions, the system endured. The skeptics who had once compared the Bell to a fragile experiment watched as real-world trials proved its strength again and again. In Washington, admirals who had once raised eyebrows at Mommsen's stubbornness now endorsed rescue training schools, built entirely around his methods. Classrooms filled with young divers studying the diagrams of the Squalus operation line by line, learning how minute adjustments in pressure or cable tension could decide life or death. New officers memorized the sequence of events not as folklore, but as doctrine. They traced the descent paths, examined the load charts, and repeated the equalization procedures until they became instinct. The rescue was no longer a story, it was a standard. For the next generation of submarine officers, the Squalus operation stood as a turning point, the moment when the service stopped relying on luck and began relying on engineering. They studied how the survivors rationed their breath, how the divers endured the cold, how the Bell overcame the currents. They reviewed the mistakes that led to the sinking and the ingenuity that ensured it was not a massacre. The event became a required lesson in humility. Technology could fail, but discipline, preparation, and innovation could bridge the gap when it did. Innovation born from tragedy soon permeated every layer of undersea warfare. New escape apparatuses were issued, pressure suits were updated, boats were redesigned with more forgiving redundancies. Every modification carried the same echo. The rescue had rewritten the boundaries of possibility. What had once been radical became routine. The Bell that engineers had mocked as impractical, untested, and unnecessary was now an indispensable part of the fleet's identity. In the corner of one training hall, a replica of the original Bell sat on display, its walls dented, its paint worn thin, its silhouette unmistakable. Cadets paused before it, running their hands along the cold steel, absorbing the weight of what had been accomplished. It did not look heroic. It looked functional, unadorned, an unassuming vessel that had carried hope through 240 feet of darkness. And as new technologies emerged, they all traced their lineage back to that single moment when invention met necessity. And necessity rewrote the future, leading to the final revelation the Navy had yet to confront. In the years that followed the Squalus disaster, the men who rose from the dark hull went on to live lives shaped not by the hours they had nearly lost, but by the years they reclaimed. Many served through the coming World War, carrying their experience into the submarine service that grew exponentially during the conflict. Some commanded boats in the Pacific, guiding younger crews through patrols where silence and pressure once again defined survival. Others trained recruits, teaching them the quiet virtues that had sustained them: discipline, composure, and the knowledge that even in absolute darkness, order could be preserved. Their presence in the wartime fleet became a reminder that the ocean could take much, but not everything. For their families, the memory settled differently. They remembered the knock on the door not as an announcement of loss, but of salvation, an inversion so rare in naval history that it remained a fixed point for the rest of their lives. Mothers recalled the telegrams that arrived with an unfamiliar word attached: rescued. Wives spoke of the moment when fear dissolved into disbelief, when the sea that had taken so many sailors returned 33 without a single fatality among the survivors. It became a personal mythology within households, proof that sometimes the world offered second chances where none were expected. Across generations of submariners, the rescue came to embody something larger than a technical success. It became a testament to endurance, to engineering, to the discipline of men who refused panic even as the air thickened and the lights dimmed. Recruits learned the story as part of their heritage. Veterans recounted it as evidence that courage could be quiet and measured, not loud or impulsive. They understood that the events of May 1939 had revealed a truth often overlooked. Trapped submariners do not survive by chance. They survive through preparation, through routines repeated until they become instinct, through systems built not for glory, but for the worst day a sailor can face. The ocean itself remained unchanged, vast, indifferent, unmoved by the drama it had briefly hosted. But in its indifference, it revealed something essential about the people who challenged it. The Atlantic did not grant victories or tragedies. It only presented tests. What humanity drew from those tests, what meaning it carved from the pressure and darkness, belonged entirely to the sailors, the divers, the engineers, and the families whose lives intersected with that silent world below. In this way, the ocean served not as teacher or adversary, but as mirror. In the aftermath, technological skepticism softened into humility. The officers and engineers who had once dismissed the bell learned that innovation rarely announces its importance in peacetime. New tools often appear unnecessary until the moment they are the only thread between life and death. The Squalus rescue forced the Navy to understand that doctrine must be flexible, that certainty must be questioned, and that safety is built not on pride but on continuous revision. Every advancement after 1939 carried a shadow of that lesson. Never assume the problem solved. Never consider the sea conquered. Ultimately, the triumph of the rescue did not come from confidence. It came from persistence, from Mommsen's unwavering belief in method over assumption, from divers who trusted their training even as the cold stung their hands numb, from sailors who breathed lightly for hours to stretch what little air remained. The victory belonged to repetition, patience, and the refusal to abandon possibility. It was not the dramatic heroism of a sudden act, but the steady accumulation of thousands of disciplined choices. And as decades passed, as technology advanced beyond the original bell, and new generations of submariners inherited the lessons paid for by those trapped hours, the story of Squalus settled into naval history not as legend, but as proof. They called it impractical once. The ocean taught them otherwise.